Now, in South Africa, there has already been a move towards the nationalisation of mineral rights with the 2002 Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act. If I can read to you a section of that, the Act acknowledges the right of the state to exercise sovereignty over all mineral and petroleum resources within the Republic. However, the policy on minerals and mining does not make provision for the nationalisation of mining assets, but it does not preclude the state from participating actively in mining. What does this mean on a practical level?
Well, at the practical level, you separate, the ability of the state, firstly, to influence and control what happens with mineral and petroleum resources, as opposed to necessarily own as equity stakes, and what happens when that ownership vests in the state and what it does with it. So clearly, this Petroleum and Minerals Resources Development Act does not necessarily give equity ownership to the state. What it does provide for the state is a degree of control in which it can issue mining licenses for exploration, for expropriation, for discovery, and for actual mining and extraction. But those concessions are facilitated and given and granted by the state. The state does not necessarily own it. What the state can do is perhaps direct the way in which ownership is distributed, and that's the extent to which the state has influence over mineral and other resources, extracted or otherwise. But it does not necessarily own it. The debate now, I think, is shifting towards actual ownership. But actual ownership means having to take direct operational control, because at the moment, even through this Petroleum and Mineral Resources Development Act, the state does not take operational responsibility for what happens in the sector, for extraction particularly, even for prospecting or for discovery. They merely facilitate and to a mild degree direct how it can happen. But when you start taking direct operational control, it requires a whole range of other things. And those things are about high-level executive skills, about the ability to raise capital and finance, about direct operations in procurement, supply chains, logistics, transportation. Then it requires high-level management, because you have to manage the operation, you have to manage staff. So the question about whether this nationalization will then necessarily mean that you will be able to increase labor standards is not in and of itself necessarily true. If that was the case, then we wouldn't have, even at the moment, public sector workers going out on strike repeatedly. The fact that you will have public ownership by definition means that you will increase labor standards, that you will increase safety standards, that you will have more safe and effective and efficient running mines, is not by definition true. Because if it were, then we wouldn't have the problems we have in state-owned enterprises, in municipalities, and in the public service generally. Secondly, on a management score, clearly what the state currently has to manage, it is not doing so terribly effectively. And the idea that it will now enter a new terrain and take operational management responsibility in this area is also far from settled. Then on the question of redistribution, whether this will engage in an effective process of redistribution across the society is also not true. We, over the last 15 years of our transition, in every budget that we've had, the social expenditure sector has always been high, consistently around 75%, if you include transfers and subsidies to the poor, like free basic services and other social wages. Then you do have close to 77%, right? The question, though, is that even though you have very high expenditure, why do you have such high levels of poverty persisting, and why is inequality increasing and have now reached the worst levels of inequality that there has ever been? Because clearly, if so much money was being directed towards this redistributionary impulse in the society, and yet is not relieving some of the legacies of apartheid, the legacies of inequality, the relative sense of power versus powerlessness in the society, then by definition, the fact that the state might take over running the mines, and that it will therefore, by logical conclusion, extend the redistributionary benefits, is also far from settled. I think the debate is that it potentially can do so, but practically the indicators are that that has not in fact happened. And if we take the last example, the arms deal, where there was the promise that there would be these large industrial offsets, and these industrial offsets are not only going to have equity benefits for greater ownership across the society, particularly for black South Africans, to own things, but at the same time also engage in the fact that you will have increased jobs being created. That has not in fact been the case. We haven't seen the benefits of this of these industrial offsets yet, and so the idea that, you know, if we nationalize mines, we certainly will have a broader complement in the state to be able to increase revenues for the state, number one, and number two, redistribute them and run these things or these operations effectively, you know, is far from settled. And there hasn't been a well-informed, I think, debate about all of this. If we take the question back and say, what is the purpose, what is the desired outcomes, what is the objective of nationalization, then we should ask what the objectives and the purpose and the outcomes that we intend it to be, and investigate whether there may be in fact other ways in which those goals and objectives could be achieved. And some people might argue that they in fact can. The state might be able to take this current Minerals and Petroleum Resource Development Act and create more prescriptive policies about what proportion and percentage of revenues which are made in those areas must be taxed more highly or redistributed in different ways, or that you will have different kinds of ownership schemes, even though they would be largely privately owned, that you can enter some degrees of public-private ownership with the mines. These are all models which can still be investigated, but clearly we have to ask more basic questions about what the purpose, what the goal, what the objective of the nationalization agenda would be.
On a political level, it seems to me that this is a very emotional debate. Like the ANC Youth League is trying to prove something. It's based on a narrow political motive. What is their motive, do you think? What are they trying to achieve?
It's very difficult to assume or to even get at what the Youth League is thinking. I think that there is a commitment at a principled level, and has been a very long commitment. If you look at the Freedom Charter dating back to 1955, that nationalization would be intended to serve the purpose of returning mineral wealth to a public, that it would benefit the society as a whole. The reality, however, in practice has shown that once ownership in particularly state-owned enterprises, and even for functions that the state is responsible for, has not worked effectively and has not worked as efficiently and has not served the purpose that it ought to have served, then clearly we enter a different dimension of the debate. A sinister reading might suggest that this is a desire to facilitate ownership within the mines to benefit a particular political and social elite and social class, rather than to serve a public interest. That's a sinister interpretation. Now,
seems to be the general interpretation.
It does for the moment, but it's very hard to say that this is indeed and in fact the interpretation or the desire that the Youth League has. If it is indeed that, and the evidence does slowly begin to point that that is the case, it is about rent seeking amongst a particular political elite who are well connected, who will be able to exploit the proceeds for private accumulation, for private gain, then of course it's not going to serve the public interest. At the moment, as unsatisfactory as the way in which private owners in the mining industry and in elsewhere in our society have behaved, and if you think about price fixing scandals, if you think about the super accumulation, the excessive executive pay, the large shareholdings that certain executives have in private operations, they've set the tone for why this backlash and this reaction has happened. So clearly the idea that we need a new social contract is becoming increasingly clear in South Africa, and what that social contract is going to have to imply is that on the part of labour, it will have to ensure that if it wants to maintain a regulated labor market with sufficient guarantees of decent jobs, which attached to which are certain social protections and a fair wage, then levels of productivity have to increase. On the other hand, the private sector has to signal that it has a real interest in creating a larger number of jobs, that its sole purpose, even though is profit and profit accumulation, that it's not going to do so to the super extent that it has over the last little while. Because, you know, Amy, there was this idea that the global credit crunch, fuel finance crisis has really hampered South Africa's development with respect to increasing jobs. To a degree, that is true, but it is not the whole story. The whole story is that even in the boom years of large amounts of economic growth, when the potential to increase the size of the labor market, the opportunity was not taken by the private sector. But the state also has had a role to play here. In the years of the gear policy, and at least in the early years, when the size of the public sector was cut down fairly drastically, and the functions of the private sector were also reduced to a degree, it means that the state itself shed a lot of jobs. On the society front, even though the private sector and the state may have created the jobs, the level of productivity and the skills required to fill those jobs was not there. So clearly this problem and these what some people might call binding constraints have emerged not from one or other role player in the society. Every sector in the society has been in part at fault to the way in which we've reached this current crucible. And the way out is that everyone's going to have to make a commitment. All sectors have to make a commitment to upscaling their efficiencies and their effectiveness, upscaling their productivity, and at the same time ensuring that people are going to work hard and be committed to the jobs that they do have and do it to the best of their ability, and try and develop the skills, the training, and everything else which is required to be able to do those jobs efficiently and effectively. In the absence of this broad bargain amongst the different role players, it's difficult to see a way out. Because clearly if the private sector simply believes that it must be business as usual and super accumulation, and that people in the state, people who are politically connected, believe that they will take their cue and their signal from those super accumulation tendencies, they will believe that if those other people can do it, why can't we? And we will then use whatever political and other connections we have to design a system which will simply benefit our basis of accumulation. On the other hand, the social cultures which exist in the society around levels of productivity, attitudes to work, those also need to change. And clearly that's the bargain I think we're looking at now.
So rather than seeing this nationalisation debate as the ANC Youth League trying to put a point across, I'm beginning to see why President Jacob Zuma is letting the debate continue rather than putting a stop to it and saying, listen, this is not policy.
I think it's unhelpful to either shut down the debate on the one hand, but on the other hand it is equally unhelpful to simply stick to the notion that nationalisation in and of itself is going to be the panacea of and the solution to all the problems that we might have, particularly if we're thinking about redistribution as the real agenda. Clearly there's nuances and there's degrees to which we have to investigate this quite seriously, quite carefully, with a well-informed basis for decision making. Being wedded simply to the idea that we must shut down the debate, it is not necessarily going to work, is as equally unhelpful as sticking to the fact that nationalisation is the only way to go.
Thank you, Ebrahim. That was Ebrahim Fakir of the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa speaking on the nationalisation debate.